I write biographies, and biographers really rely on primary sources. And these may be government files put in the Public Record Office, now the National Archives, or they may be private diaries and letters. And so when I came to start researching the dual biography of Dickie and Edwina Mountbatten in 2015, I was very keen to see their diaries and letters, which had been quoted extensively in previous books on them. For those of you who don't know who Dickie and Edwina Mountbatten are, they are a most extraordinary couple in an open marriage, which in some ways was a very powerful public partnership. He was commander of combined operations during the Second World War, then Supreme Allied Commander in Southeast Asia, and eventually the last Viceroy of India. And she was the last Viceroy. And so it's a portrait of a marriage and a portrait of two public lives and public lives which intertwined. She went on to have a long-standing affair with Nehru, the Prime Minister of India, and which has created quite a bit of criticism because it suggested that she was perhaps more partial. They were more partial towards the Indians than they were to the Pakistanis during independence. Anyway, in 2015, I went to Southampton University, which holds the diaries and letters, asking to look at them, and was told that they knew nothing about them. Now, this was a surprise to me because there'd been a huge public fundraising campaign led by Southampton to bring the diaries to Southampton, which are close to the Mountbatten country house, Broadlands in Hampshire. And something like £5 million of our money was spent buying these diaries and letters, which were seen as probably the second most important private collection of material after Churchill's diaries and letters, now at Churchill College, Cambridge. And they consisted of the letters between the couple between 1920 and 1960, when Edwina died, her diary up to 1960, and his diary until he was assassinated by the IRA until in 1979. And they were very extensive. It runs to about 30,000 pages. Anyway, eventually, after a whole series of freedom of information requests, the Information Commissioner, which is in charge of, I suppose, this freedom of information material, ruled that this material should be released, that it had been withheld illegally by Southampton. It, after all, been bought with our money to be seen by scholars. This court case which took place in November, and we're waiting for a decision any moment now, was the appeal by both Southampton and the the Cabinet Office against that decision. Now, the reason that we've got the Cabinet Office involved in this is that they claimed that there had been, that Mountbatten had agreed that his papers would be vetted by the government before they were released. Now, this actually was a complete lie. What he had agreed to in 1969 was that his public papers, what we call strayed records, which had been taken away from his work in the Ministry of Defence, where he was the first Sea Lord and Chief of Defence Staff, should be returned, or at least be looked at, to come into line with the Public Record Office. But there was no question that these diaries and letters, which were private between a couple, should ever have any sort of censorship. But they stuck to this line. They've actually dropped that line in the course of the hearing in November. And so they really shouldn't have been there at all. And the point that I'm sort of been fighting is that the family actually sold these letters and diaries very freely. They'd actually already been vetted. They sold them to pay for a roof at Broadlands. They could have gone to a private individual who would, of course, either made them available or not as they chose. It could have gone to an American institution, which would have made them available. So the fact that Southampton, having bought them with public monies, this was £5 million in lieu of tax or indeed grants from people like Hampshire County Council, the Heritage Lottery Fund. This money, since it was bought with our money, it should have been made available to us. And that was the whole point of the fundraising campaign. What was an added scandal was that it was unilaterally closed by a particular archivist who then came to an arrangement with the Cabinet Office to edit the diaries and letters himself. So we had this hearing, but meanwhile, quietly over the last few months, the Southampton, who said it was impossible to make this material available, it was too delicate, it was too difficult to read, it was too expensive for them to do, actually have now released 99% of this material. And one of the interesting things is having now read the material, There is nothing at all sensational in it, nothing that they claimed could scare the horses or affect the royal family, which was their excuse. This is the sort of stuff that a couple would write to each other when they're parted, the sort of stuff they put in their diaries. And that even the references to the royal family are pretty innocuous. They're, we sold a horse to Prince Philip, we went and had tea with Lilibet, we went and stayed at Windsor, or went shooting at Sandringham. This is not stuff that is at all sensitive. One of the other things that we found going through the redactions, and there were 100 redactions left, which were challenging, are of material which they claim should be covered by data protection. But these are often names of staff which are already in the public domain, either because they've appeared in books, often authorized by the royal family themselves. They've appeared in the official book on the Mountbattens by Philip Ziegler. They've appeared in previous diaries which have been published, or they have appeared in the London Gazette. So I think it's very difficult to argue that this stuff should be kept secret when it's already been made public. And time again, we've found that material that the government has said relates to the Queen doesn't relate to the Queen at all. It relates to something quite separate. For example, Mountbatten had a fetish about women in riding gear. So some of the stuff that's been taken out relates to that, nothing to do with the royal family. And I think this goes to a wider issue that has worried me as a historian for some time now, that the government and royal family are trying to censor our history, are trying to curate the narrative, and are trying to control the story. And that, of course, that's the mark of a banana republic. It's not really what historians should be doing. We should be trying to discover the truth about the past. And I think one of the extraordinary things that I've discovered in the last 15, 20 years of writing these books is that we really don't know our history, that the history that's handed down to us is actually only a partial story, and that much of it is hidden, either because of the Official Secrets Act, or because people have taken secrets to the grave, or because the story has been contained. I mean, one of the interesting things, for example, is that much of this material has been sent to the Royal Archives, where it is not available to researchers. There is no inventory there for people to look at. There's nothing you can order. You just go there, and I've discovered this having just written a book about King Edward VIII. And they give you what they choose to give you. It's a bit like going to a restaurant where there's no menu. You just take what they're just serving that particular night. And I think this is a very worrying question for not just historians, but for us as a nation, because we aren't getting a true picture of the past. Historians are not getting access to archives. This is, as I say, the mark of some sort of dictatorship, which is telling us the story of our history, rather than letting that history evolve. And we have huge debates now about the fact that we're not telling our history properly. We didn't look at slavery or all these other issues properly. There was a bias. And there may well have been a bias amongst historians, but I think there's now a bias because we aren't actually getting the seed, the blocks that we need to build the story of the past, which are the documents. And that's probably a good place to stop, except to say that having had to defend this appeal, which it hadn't at that stage cost me anything, I was forced to bring in lawyers. And what the government in Southampton have done, and they've been actually found to be in contempt of court by not answering questions, is that they basically tried to fight this by telling untruths and by delaying tactics. I mean, this decision of the Information Commissioner was actually in 2019, and we've only just heard the case. It's forced me to spend a huge amount of money, something like £250,000 of my own money, plus another £100,000 of money from crowdfunding. And so I've been forced to go to a site called Crowd Justice to basically call in donations from people who are worried about this issue to help finance my campaign. We're hoping that not only will we get our costs back and hopefully repay people, but also two other questions have risen. One is that the correspondence between Edwina and Nehru, which lasted for a space of about 13 years, often several letters a day, so it runs to hundreds and hundreds of letters, That was bought with this original purchase in 2010 and to be made available, and has not been made available. So we're fighting to get that correspondence released, and as I say, to get these legal costs reimbursed. But I'm hoping that this is making a stand against government interference, and it is a sort of David and Goliath battle. What I think has happened is that there are no secrets there in the diaries and letters, like there will be in the Nero correspondence. But this is the government trying to flex its muscle and basically a face-saving exercise, because they realized that they really had no grounds to hold this material back, but they've had to try and justify it. Anyway, I'm very happy to answer any questions or to talk about the issue further. But what does worry me is that under the Public Records Act, materials from the government departments have to be sent to the National Archives unless they fall within various exemptions, such as national security. And that is not taking place. The government have used COVID, for example, as an excuse not to do that, but it's a long-running problem. We have archives going back to the Victorian period, which have not been released. And what I've also discovered is that many archives are just destroyed with no record being kept. So we don't even know what the material is. The MOD destroys something like 80% of its files. And these aren't duplicates. These are often the most sensitive files. And it's a real concern for us historians, because we've got already the era of sofa government. We've got the fact that discussions are not minuted in the way they used to be. So historians cannot see how judgments were raised. And we have even less transparency now. And I think particularly we've seen during COVID that if you're going to trust a government in a national emergency, you have to have some transparency and accountability. Otherwise, as I say, we're living in China and not in a democracy.